Software documentation is one of the key factors that distinguishes between a mature engineer and everyone else. So let's talk about why we need it, what it is, and how we can make sure that your documentation in the future is always up to snuff. So to start, what is software documentation? Well, it comes in about 4 types. We'll say process documentation, product documentation, developer documentation, and user documentation. Each of these types are targeted for a specific audience and have their own best practices as well as standards for what we need to include in them. For the product documentation, we want to understand what the system is and the components that make it up, as well as why we even need it, right? Then we have developer documentation, which is going to focus on how do we build, run, and add to the code base that is supporting this system. This is going to be something very close to the code. Then we may have user documentation, depending on if the end user is actually is someone other than the developer. And that documentation is more focused on how do I use certain functionality or features of the application, and how do I troubleshoot if I do run into an issue that something isn't behaving the way we expect it to behave. And then we have process documentation, which is one of my favorites, and it's going to specify how do we deploy, monitor, operate, and maintain the system that we're building and using, and how do we make sure we're doing it in the most reliable way. Because when things change, we need to make sure that we're able to get up and running as quickly as possible with as minimum downtime as we can afford. So I talked about what software documentation is. Now let's talk about why it's important. We have all of those different user roles that I mentioned, or those different archetypes, right? We have the developer, we have the product owner who is in charge of the product, we have the end user who needs to use the product, and then we have the process people, or I would say DevOps roles, operators, that are going to be doing things with the software. All of these people need that software documentation to make sure that they're able to do their job each and every day. If that documentation did not exist, they'd start to have issues doing very simple things, starting an application, walking a user through solving an issue in production, or even just how do we get this application to production, even though it works on my laptop. That's one of the favorite, I don't want to say excuses, but one of the favorite lines of developers in industry. But we want to make sure that we have documentation in place that'll make sure it works everywhere it needs to work and with anyone who needs to use it. I like to think of the analogy of a car. Would you get behind the wheel of a vehicle if you don't know how to drive, or if you don't know the rules or understand the rules of the road? Now, I know a lot of us might say, yeah, because it's fun to drive, right? But when we're thinking about mission critical systems and software that is in front of live users and is actually capturing data, is actually running in the real world that people rely on for government, healthcare, financials, things like that, we can't be shooting from the hip with those types of software systems. We need to make sure that the things that we're building are actually going to last and be maintainable and reliable, no matter the number of users, no matter the time of day or where it's being used at, because these are really important, right? We want to make sure that we're as safe as possible with the software that we're building. And one of the easiest ways to make your software safe is to ensure that you have the right documentation in place to support all of the users who are going to be interacting with that software. So let's talk about how do we write great software documentation, right? I'm going to go through 3 tips right now to make sure that when you're in your role, that the documentation you're creating is always the best and useful to your team. So for the first tip, I'm going to say, remember that documentation is for someone. We have those 4 types of documentation, which can be used by the same person, or it can be used by 4 different people across 4 different teams. You have to make sure that the specific documentation that you're working on at this time is best suited for the audience that it'll be placed in front of whenever that time comes. So you want to make sure you are clarifying any vocabulary and jargon that might seem easy and understandable and clear for someone at one archetype, but may be totally confusing and not clear to someone in a different part of the organization. Tip 2, document the why for why decisions were made and for what decisions were made. When you're building some product, you may go through a dozen reasons or a dozen potential solutions before you come up and lock in that final solution. You might test half a dozen of those solutions, and before you realize that they won't work now that you've tried them. Make sure you're documenting that type of context, because as a engineer, if I come across a problem that's similar, then I may try to do the same thing that you already tried before. But if there's no documentation in place to tell me, hey, this was tried already, this was done already, and it didn't work, then I'm going to spend a lot of time redoing work that was already done. And this is a waste of energy at a certain level and a waste of time and resources when you're trying to move and build things really quickly. So make sure you're documenting that why for the person who comes after you, or even the you a few weeks or months or years from now who needs to upgrade or maintain the system as things are starting to change. Because even you might see something that was tried before that was an issue before that may also be a solution now. So having that documentation and that context in place is going to be super useful. And 3, treat your documentation as a living entity, as a living thing, because your system is going to grow and change. The environment the system runs in is going to change and evolve. The documentation cannot be a static component of that system. You need to make sure that you're updating any types of diagrams, you're updating any steps that are being added to, for any type of functionality. You want to make sure that the documentation is up to date with the current version of your application, so that if I'm seeing an issue in a previous version, I know that, hey, this documentation is not actually applicable for what I'm looking at. Maybe I need to go look at the documentation that existed when this code was actually deployed and ran, because you don't want to have stale documentation, because that's just as bad as not having it at all, right? It's probably even worse, because someone may think they're solving one issue using the stale documentation and that legacy documentation and realize the issue that they're working on isn't even in the same realm, but they didn't know that because the documentation wasn't kept up to date. So make sure you're building and growing it as your system is starting to build and change. And then I want to add a bonus tip for the builders who are actually creating these software applications, right? As you're creating an application and you're trying things out, do your best to capture notes on the things and actions that you're taking. If you tried a specific step, or if you ran this type of command, or if you got some resources here that help make sense of the problem you were solving, capture all of that knowledge and put it somewhere. You may not, as you're building, you don't need to be working on the documentation at that point, but having it somewhere that you can go back to when it is time to create that documentation will be super helpful for you, and make it much simpler for when you actually do want to have that ready documentation in place. You could even run the documentation through ChatGPT or some other tool, AI tool that you use, to actually convert your notes into something useful and ready to present to others. But those raw notes are going to be gold whenever you do want to go back and document what you've done. Because you may be working on a bug that took you a few days or a few weeks to actually solve, and there were some steps in there that you won't remember after that 2 weeks. So keep that in mind. And then, last but not least, I want to kind of encourage everyone, for the next time that you join a team and you're figuring out how to get started, focus and find the documentation for the system that you're working on, or for the team. And if you notice that there's some documentation that needs to be updated, then do your best from those KT sessions or those knowledge transfer sessions to gather that knowledge, put it together in a format that is useful for the team, and publish it somewhere where everyone can access it. That'll be a quick way to get an easy win when you're just getting started. So, hope this was helpful, and good luck.